Welcome to BCEC's Secret Brisbane podcast. I'm Alison Gardner, Director of Sales at the Brisbane Convention and Exhibition Centre, which is known as BCEC to our friends. In attracting national and international conferences to Brisbane, BCEC has the real privilege of working and collaborating across many industries, all levels of government, with leading scientists and technologists and wonderful destination partners. So we see a side of Brisbane that many are not aware is humming away in the background, with people who are creating extraordinary outcomes for Australia and the world. It's a bit like the unseen side of cities, and we want to share our favourite Brisbane insights with you. Welcome to episode 1, called COVID's Cancelled, isn't it? It feels like we're all steadily losing the will to care about COVID-19. We all want to look ahead with hope, and we want to move on from the last 2 years. But, and that's the question, is there even a but to that? We did our first video interview on this topic with Ian Fraser 2 years ago, and it seems appropriate then for our first podcast episode to ask the question, COVID's cancelled, isn't it? And to answer that, I'd like to introduce Paul Young, Professor of Research Development at the University of Queensland. Paul co-led the development of Australia's main COVID-19 vaccine successfully right through phase 1 clinical trials. Tragically, as some of you might remember, it didn't go further because of cross-reactivity issues with HIV screening tests. But, showing huge resilience, Paul's team are now taking the research forward again, developing new versions of the vaccine for other diseases using the same rapid response platform technologies. He's a world-leading virologist, a COVID global expert, and one of Brisbane's hidden heroes in my view. He's a long-time friend of BCEC, and I'm delighted to chat to him today. Welcome, Professor Paul Young.
Thanks, Alison. Wonderful to be here.
So, all things COVID, is it actually cancelled? According to the World Health Organization, we're at the, in parenthesis, finishing line for COVID, and there is a sense in Australia that COVID kind of has been cancelled. Are we done and dusted?
Short answer, no. Longer answer is more complicated. WHO has not declared the pandemic over. Pandemic is still on from their perspective. We have still the potential of new variants emerging, and that's certainly going to play out over the coming winter months in Northern Hemisphere. If you recall, towards the end of 2021, everyone at the end of, as we came off the Delta wave, everyone was predicting that was the end of it. And of course, along came Omicron. So we're a little bit short of being able to predict that this is the end. I know that's what everyone wants to hear. We've had 2 years of COVID and everyone's tired of it. And the big conversation at the moment is, whether we should be masking and where we should be masking. A lot of scientific advice is suggesting we should be, but there are broader questions around there. The government, societal, policy discussions as well as the medical discussions at the moment. My personal view is I think we've gone the right direction in terms of putting it into the category of personal responsibility, but I think we're failing in getting the message out there that there are still concerns. We've still got thousands of people in hospital with COVID, new infections are happening all the time. Admittedly, we're on the downward turn, and let's hope that we're heading out of this pandemic, but we're not quite there yet.
So, this issue of pandemics are then going into an endemic phase. Are we at the crossroads of that at least?
There's no hard and fast rule as to when a pandemic becomes an endemic. Different people use
no criteria?
No. I mean, there are some basic criteria. Pandemic basically refers to the fact that we have a global spread of a disease in a somewhat unpredictable nature. Endemic can also be globally spread, but it's more predictable. I mean, think of influenza.
Yeah.
Influenza is considered an epidemic or an endemic disease that occasionally flares up. We know that it happens every winter and we prepare for it with appropriate vaccines. In the context of a pandemic, you're just not quite sure where you're at. There's a degree of unpredictability there, and I think we're still in that phase. It could be argued that we're still in the HIV pandemic. It could be argued that we still have a tuberculosis pandemic globally. Millions of people are dying every year of those two diseases. So, whether one calls it a pandemic or endemic, I think isn't the critical feature here. It's how you actually handle society dealing with those particular threats.
Okay, so you've definitely answered the question. There is a but. Do you think then that our future is now all about annual boosters and antivirals?
Yeah, I think we're probably heading into an area where we are going to be looking at dealing with COVID somewhat similarly to the way we deal with influenza, and that is maybe yearly, maybe every 2 years, vaccines that comprise modified vaccines based on the current circulating variants. We do that with influenza every year.
Yeah.
We don't need to go back into clinical trials to ensure that those vaccines are okay, because we've got enough history with them to know that we can change a few amino acids within the protein to match the current variant, that will be safe. And I think the current mRNA vaccines have the capacity to be modified very quickly. They are going back into clinical trials because they're still playing with the formulation to ensure that it's actually a vaccine that can be delivered on a routine basis to a large section of the population. I'm sure many of your listeners will have experienced the perhaps 1 or 2 days of adverse reactions to the
included.
Pfizer vaccine, me included as well. And what we need to do, or what the companies need to do, are develop new formulations that minimise those. Again, we're in the early days of this vaccine. It was rolled out very quickly to address a severe and present concern. But what will have to happen over the near future is further development of those vaccines. If there's new formulations, they will need to go back into clinical trials. But eventually we'll reach a space where we have regular vaccine uptake. What is happening with a number of different companies is they're trying to marry the influenza and the COVID vaccine, so it's a one-shot vaccine approach.
Well, that would be a lot easier for everybody.
It certainly would. And antivirals are there. It's stating the obvious that vaccines are the best way to prevent infection in communities. They're the most cost-effective way. They're the most effective in terms of preventing infection. Antivirals are there to treat people who are infected.
So it's almost like the triage.
Yeah. And we didn't have those antivirals for COVID. We do now have a suite of some antivirals. They're not perfect, and many are still under development. We're particularly looking at antivirals that have broader reactivity against multiple variants. One of the advantages of antivirals versus vaccines is that we probably can come up with antivirals that cover all of the coronaviruses, for example. Again, we're not quite there yet, but because of the targets of those drugs, namely internal parts of the virus that are needed for its own replication, that are shared right across the coronaviruses, if you develop a drug for one, there's more chance that it will have reactivity against the other variants. Vaccines, much more challenging because they're targeted primarily to the outer coat protein, which can vary dramatically. There's no, apart from binding to cells and helping the virus gain entry, there's multiple places on the spike protein that can vary and does vary under antibody selection pressure.
I don't think anybody's ever been more familiar with the spike protein than we have now.
One of the things that's just staggered me over recent times, I was at a family barbecue recently, and there was this family conversation around rats and PCR, and I was just sitting back thinking, wow, these people who are not scientists, but the language is there. There's been an amazing education of the population over the last 2.5 years in science, and an uptake in the acceptance of science as a source of information. I hope we maintain that.
I do too, and to be honest, this is part of the value of having people like you in our city to be able to have these kind of layman's person's chats and kind of put our heads on, because everybody's kind of going, where are we up to now? So talking about where we're up to now, I guess long COVID seems alive and well. Why do some people get it and some people don't?
Don't know.
Right, that's a short answer.
It's a short answer. The longer answer of that is we're still in the early days of understanding exactly what long COVID is. And it does, you're quite right, does impact different people differently. But at a high percentage, in a number of independent studies, I think it's upwards of 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 suffer long COVID, various aspects of long COVID symptoms following a COVID infection. There are a number of theories about what long COVID is. First thing I should mention is one that a lot of the medical community have been trying to get out there into popular understanding, and that is COVID is not flu. Right. Influenza is an unusual infection. It affects the respiratory tract. That's where it comes in. You breathe it in. It replicates, divides, and causes damage at the respiratory tract. And that's where it leaves. It actually doesn't spread anywhere else. It stays localized. The problem with COVID is that that's its entry point, but it also spreads. It can spread through the bloodstream to pretty much most tissues it's been found in. So that's where we have a major problem with COVID. The three main theories at the moment, and these might change over time, but the three that are gaining most traction at the moment are, the first is that through this COVID, the virus spread through the body and the damage that it causes, there is the formation of these microclots that are blocking our bloodstream, and that damages a number of different target tissues. So many clots that stay there for a long time are causing problems. One potential therapy to that might be anticoagulation therapy. So people are looking at that. The second is the virus isn't cleared like a lot of other viral infections are. It does seem to persist. So it's been found in a lot of tissues many months after the initial infection. So it's continuing to cause damage. It's also continuing to trigger the immune response so that you're continuing to see the consequences of an over-robust immune response as well. A lot of the disease we see in many respiratory infections are actually exactly that, immunopathology, the over-targeted response of our own immune system.
So just on that point, so you're essentially saying that the way we react and the symptoms we have is not so much the virus, that's our own immune system? Yeah,
it's like, so we've got a brilliantly evolved defense mechanism. The immune system split into two basic categories. The innate immune response, which will respond generically to whatever insult you have, and then an adaptive immune response, which develops a more specific response to targeted organisms. It's what we try to induce, for example, with a vaccine. You get an adaptive immune response such that next time you see that pathogen, virus or otherwise, you mount a very targeted immune response. But the way we do that, the way our immune system does that, is to upregulate a whole suite of different genes and gene products that turn cells on to do this. They're metabolically more active. Lots of things are happening. Lots of proteins are being secreted from these cells to produce an inflammatory response, so an immune infiltration into the sites of infection to defend ourselves. The trouble with that is there are lots of consequences of that over-robust immune response. When you get a cold, you get aches and pains and a little bit of fever and so on. Virtually all of that is not direct result of the virus, but actually our own immune response. There are specific molecules that are stimulating that response in us.
I think that's certainly a surprise to me. Yeah. It's an interesting way to look at it and understand it.
Yeah, the way I like to look at it is the immune system is like a tunable radio, and it's a volume switch, and but it also has built-in auto-regulatory mechanisms which can turn it off. So they come into play. Last thing you want is an immune system that's continually stimulated, right? So where the volume's always up, because that's where you generate all of these symptoms. And what are some of the long COVID symptoms? There's fatigue, there's aches and pains, joint pain. Those are all symptoms of, similar symptoms to an over-robust immune response. So that's the third area where people are really looking at potential therapies, working out ways of dampening our own immune response, so targeting our immune system rather than the virus to turn off all of these overtly defensive mechanisms that are actually causing more damage than protection.
I think that's really heartening to hear how much work's going on in that space.
It's huge.
Yeah, and again, that's a bit of a hidden thing happening across the world and in many cities everywhere. So I have to say that makes me sleep better at night. So when you look back then, and what did we actually learn? I mean, can you just perhaps help explain, I was fascinated to find out about this organisation, the Global Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, known as CEPI, if I've got that right.
Yeah.
And that's been working with research teams around the world on disease X, as they call it, in conjunction with the WHO before COVID even started. Were we prepared in that sense, or?
Well, I think that I'll give my short and long answers again. The short answer this time is yes. And the longer answer is perhaps give a little potted history of that. It all really started in, with a series of outbreaks where WHO had continually been getting criticism about the way that their response was very reactive. You know, something would happen, they would react, as opposed to being prepared. Always challenging to be prepared for the unknown. But it really came to the fore in 2015-16 with the Ebola outbreak in Africa. And WHO got severe criticism for the tardiness with which they responded to that. Ebola in previous outbreaks has been very constrained to small community environments, but this was one that actually spread more broadly. Just to comment that there's another outbreak of Ebola happening right at this moment in Africa. Right. It hasn't spread very far, but let's see what happens. It certainly did in 2015-16. And so WHO, you know, in addition to reacting to that outbreak, also set up a committee to start asking the question, okay, how could we be better prepared? And they came up with one idea, and that was to develop a list of priority diseases. And these were exotic pathogens that, you know, may emerge as a major threat in the future. Things like Zika, Lassa fever, Ebola, all of these viruses that we knew about, a list of about 8 of them. But they also added, for the first time, they came up with the concept of disease X, the unknown.
Wow.
And the problem with WHO, great policy organisation, quite a good surveillance organisation, but they don't have the funding and the resources to put into the development of things like preparedness vaccines that a big pharma would. And big pharma didn't have an interest in it, right? Because there's no commercial output. So who came along were organisations like the Wellcome Trust, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Economic Forum, and a number of countries, most notably Norway, who has their own. Shout out to Norway. Shout out to Norway in a big way. They have their own future fund based on North Sea oil revenue. And their future fund, they actually disseminate globally as well, not just exercises and projects within Norway, but they also fund a lot of things out externally. So they contributed a huge amount of support into this coalition. So this Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations that the Wellcome Trust had a very big part in establishing. And I went to the very first meeting in Paris in the beginning of 2017. And what struck me then was the delegates who were there. And they were from academia, from small biotech companies, and from big pharma, and from government, all saying the same thing, all singing off the same sheet in response to the Ebola outbreak. We should work better together. And so the idea of CEPIs was to build a $1.5 billion and growing financial base to fund decent levels of research that could actually address these missing gaps in vaccines and antiviral approaches, mostly vaccines, that's CEPI focus, for these known pathogens and also platform technologies for a disease X. Long story, but we come in at that stage because we'd been developing, my group's been interested in vaccines for 40 years, and we've been developing, and you know, classic stories, we proved that they work in preclinical models, can't get funding to move them across. It's called the Valley of Death. You know, out of the R&D sphere and into commercial large clinical trials, the amount of funding you need to conduct those trials is not something you can come up with small grants or the universities can provide. So there's this Valley of Death between those two. And that's what CEPI was providing. They were providing resources to allow us to cross that, to bridge the Valley of Death. And so we had a platform technology we'd been working on for about 10 years. And you know, a big shout out to Keith Chappell, who was in the group and is now running his own group, who originally came up with the idea. And with Dan Waterson, we worked up this platform technology to the point where we were able to submit an application to CEPI to develop this platform to work on disease X. And short answer to that is we got the funding. It was $15 million, which is more than you normally get in a typical NHMRC grant in this country, and allowed us to build a consortium of players that built the pipeline of activity that would put us in a good place to respond to an outbreak if it happened. And it just so happened we targeted 3 different viruses, one of which was MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, which is a coronavirus. So 2019 was the first year of the grant. We had a year of developing some expertise, building the team. January 2020 came along.
Bingo.
It was interesting, actually. Over the Christmas New Year break, all of us were hearing rumours of something happening in southern China, and I was seeing it on Twitter feeds and so on. And we all spoke as a group and said, regardless of what this is, as soon as the sequence comes out, let's treat it as a trial of our system, see if we can make a vaccine. And so the sequence was published on January the 11th. Overnight, we'd ordered the building blocks to start making our vaccine. 2 days later, we got an email from CEPI saying, well, actually, we're thinking we might need to, the news they were hearing was that this is looking
it's time to gear up.
More severe, and we might need you to go into full production. That wasn't the intention of our grant. Our grant was going to get us to a phase 1 clinical trial. They were talking about going all the way through to a vaccine that was going to be distributed. And so we made that decision was made literally within the first 2 weeks since the knowledge of the sequence. So January the 23rd, we'd committed.
That's so fast. And CEPI was obviously
crazy.
Supporting other research groups around the world similarly.
Exactly.
So
I mean, they put out the call that we responded to in 2018 was for platform technologies that could develop a vaccine from discovery of pathogen to phase 1 clinical trials in 16 weeks.
That is so super short in anybody's terms.
In 2018, no one had ever done anything like that. The shortest turnaround time for any vaccine was 4 years, but more typically it's 10 to 15 years, or maybe even longer. So talking about 16 weeks to get it to that point was challenging, but it put out the challenge. That people,
the leadership. Yeah.
That was the leadership that was required. So this is a very long answer to your question. Were we prepared because of CEPI? And the short answer is yes. I mean, I think that without a lot of those global initiatives during 2017, 18 and 19, I don't think we would have been as well prepared to do what we did in 2020, a number of different organisations that we did. I don't think the Big Pharma would have been in play. I don't think they would have come in as quickly.
We just wouldn't have got the multiple vaccine options that we did, would we?
Exactly.
I think that's so comforting because CEPI or the coalition isn't that well known in layman's world. So that's really rather comforting to know that we're on the front foot originally.
And the new challenge, they put out a new challenge now. The new challenge
So is this the next Disease X?
This is the next Disease X challenge, and that's 100 days.
Wow.
But they want 100 days from pathogen discovery to being able to distribute it. Not to clinical trial, but to be able to distribute it in an emergency fashion to the population.
And that's part of the learnings from how fast we had to gear up this time.
Correct. I mean, I think the mRNA vaccines are about the only ones that are ever going to make that because the sort of vaccines we produce, proteins, require some upstream development that just means that we might get close, but 100 days is just, to include clinical trials, is just really challenging. But I think it's those challenges that people strive to meet that drive innovation, and that's certainly what happened over 2020. I mean, the degree of cooperation, the degree of partnerships that have been established, the level of science that's been done in the last 2.5 years is just staggering. Unbelievable.
Well, that should help us all feel better at night as well, really. And it is good. I mean, we are living in a global village, but in contrast, it has felt like we're in very separate zones. I mean, it would be fair to say that each continent managed COVID differently, and so have different learnings from that. And I guess it's interesting today, CSIRO, our national research organisation, published a report on strengthening Australia's pandemic preparedness. I guess, is somebody doing that on a global level in terms of how the world differently reacted and a sense of global going forward?
So CEPI is taking some of the initiative in that, but I don't think there's enough sort of governmental engagement in that space. I think CSIRO has done a really good job. I mean, they've come up with 6 different areas that were found wanting in our own response, and so we can now focus on building those. I mean, everyone would have heard those 2 words that were begun in 2020 and we use them often now, and sovereign capability.
Yes.
And certainly supply chain problems in 2020 meant that there were challenges in everything we did. I mean, certainly in our vaccine work, there were a number of components of the pipeline of activities that we were doing that meant we could not complete those without overseas help. And so we need to develop sovereign capacity. One is vaccine manufacturing. The only vaccine manufacturing capacity we have in Australia is CSL.
Yeah.
So therein lays the reason why the government has been very interested in bringing in mRNA vaccine capacity. We've now got Moderna coming into Melbourne in that space, and there are other companies that are talking about building capacity within other jurisdictions in Australia. And there's also a growing development of national expertise in many of these spaces where we're all starting to get together. I mean, one of the big learnings, say comparing us with some other countries, is our state-based system. I think the federated health system in this country works well. We are a geographically dispersed population, small
indeed.
population, large country, and I think we need those local health systems. But when that is a problem is when you have a pandemic like we had, where you need a national response. And we didn't really get that. So one of the learnings out of this is that we need to have a better coordinated national response in the health space. I don't know if we're going to get that. It's why there's been a lot of conversation around a CDC, Centres for Disease Control. My personal view on the model for that would be a virtual CDC, probably housed in Canberra, because the last thing you want to do is having states competing for where it should be. And it should be a policy organisation that enables the connectedness between all the state health departments.
And I assume that then each country and continent is ultimately working through the same thing themselves at the moment, isn't it?
But they are. The other point that I wanted to raise, and it's been a bugbear of CEPI's and a disappointment from CEPI's perspective, is when they began, one of the words right up front, their objective has always been equitable distribution of vaccines, and that did not happen.
We definitely did not see that.
We did not. The rich countries sorted themselves out, and the developing nations are still waiting. There are still many people who have not had vaccines globally, but now have had the infection. And let me tell you, the vaccine is much better to have than the infection. That's another misdirected idea, another myth that having the infection is a much better stimulus of the immune response. Believe me, you don't want that with this particular virus.
So I guess it's hopeful that we'll all take our learnings and condense them all together and have a sort of a global approach. But I think you hit on a really big point there about vaccine equity, which I think was very much in our faces, as it were, at certain points. I guess the issue is, do we feel optimistic now? I even sound hesitant saying it, and I'm generally an optimist. But knowing that CEPI and global R&D continues at a really furious pace, should that help us all sleep better at night as we do move through this next phase and as we renormalise?
Yeah, I'm always a glass half full person, so I do remain optimistic. I think there have been a lot of learnings we can take on board, we can develop. One has to be based on experience. I'm also a little bit pessimistic that focus will move elsewhere. With COVID becoming less dominant in our sphere of influence, and that's only right and proper. I think we do need to move on as a country. We need to be aware that it's still there, and we need to take the appropriate precautions. But we do need to move on. We need to move the economy forward. All of those things. But what I fear is that will take the gaze off the required investment and focus that needs to still be ongoing to develop those capacities into the future. So we've learnt the lessons. Will we apply the lessons?
And I think that's what makes CEPI's work obviously sound so critical in terms of it is really good to know that the next disease X, and essentially what you're saying is there will be one.
Yeah, there's no if.
There's no if, it's a when. It's a when. Hey, Paul, your team really did spearhead Queensland's research for COVID vaccine candidate. And obviously that got paused, as we mentioned earlier. But you were saying you're applying it now to other diseases, so nothing wasted. What's the direction there?
Yeah, so, again, it wasn't paused. We actually had a very successful phase 1 clinical trial with immune responses that were equivalent to or better than the leading vaccines out there. So it was a real tragedy, you're right, that it didn't progress. But it didn't progress for a real reason, and that was the diagnostic interference that it threw up. So we gave ourselves 2020 Christmas off, given that we'd been working non-stop for 2020. And the team came back in January to redesign the platform, because the platform, as I said, was proven in that phase 1 clinical trial. But we needed to change the basis of the clamp that we use to constrain the viral protein, in the case of COVID, the spike protein. We successfully found one of those, but we also had to generate a whole new bank of reagents. So it's taken us, the year and a half since to develop a new platform, which is working extremely well, and we're going to take back into the clinic early next year with, again, targeting COVID. But the long-term goal is really as a platform for new disease X's, but also other viral pathogens like influenza and so on, where we think that this platform is actually a better basis for vaccination than the current existing.
You could almost do an entire other episode on resilience and tenacity, basically. But that's I mean, for
stubbornness.
Stubbornness, that's the key factor. That's the key factor. But again, for locals here in Brisbane and people who know Brisbane well, that's really exciting. It's always really great fun talking with you, Paul. We're never short of things to say to each other, and I really appreciate your perspective. And I think that's just been exactly that kind of perspective that we wanted to know as we're sitting in this very interesting phase of our new normal. So thank you very much, Paul, and we'll no doubt talk to you again.
Thanks, Alison. It's been fun.